In the post-war settings, the ratio of taxes to national income is often very, very low. But the needs for public expenditure are very, very high. You have all of that damage to repair. You have roads, water systems, electricity systems, buildings that need to be repaired. Even if you can get some of the money for the capital expenditures from external aid, you then have to manage them. That takes revenues. So money's needed for post-war reconstruction. It's needed for funding new institutions like the National Civilian Police in El Salvador. It's needed for promoting social inclusion and gender equity to try to repair some of the damages done during the war. There's a post-war boom in aid, and it will last for some years, but it's not going to last forever. And once that aid influx recedes, the state's going to have to be in a position to step in, and it's not going to be able to get there overnight. It needs to build its capacity to raise revenue. In post-war settings, I think it's important to think about the possibilities for mobilizing revenue from three sources that I would describe as unconventional sources. This is to say, these are sources that are outside the playbook of mainstream business as usual development economics. The first of those is tariffs. The second is taxing the post-conflict aid boom itself. And the third is treating natural resources as sovereign wealth that belongs to the people as a whole rather than to certain people in the country. Tariffs, once upon a time, were the major source of government revenue in most countries in the world. In the United States, in the 19th century, for example, tariffs accounted for more than half of government revenue. And development economists have long pointed that out and said, hey, maybe there's a reason why tariffs are a good way to raise government resources in countries that have relatively low levels of per capita income. They can not only provide a convenient, easy tax handle, as it's called, where the goods come into the country. It's a relatively easy place administratively for the state to collect taxes, but also in doing so, they can perhaps give a boost to domestic producers, helping the process of economic development. In the 1970s and 1980s, that openness to tariffs amongst economists, mainstream economists, began to collapse. There was instead a view that tariffs are inefficient, that instead of protecting the domestic producers in an economy and setting in stage a process of development, what they do is they create a privileged, politically protected group of people engaging in what's called rent-seeking behavior, who maintain inefficient operations, inefficient industries, but use their political clout to make sure that the protection, tariff protection and quota protection never goes away. And these are not totally ill-founded arguments, but they were pursued with a kind of doctrinaire ruthlessness, including in post-conflict settings. Whether dismantling or reducing tariffs or eschewing tariffs as a potential source of revenue makes sense depends on, among other things, from the standpoint of this efficiency argument, are there actually domestic producers of the goods and services that you're importing? Or are they goods and services you're bringing into the country for which there are no locally produced import substitutes? For example, many war-torn countries do not have an automobile industry. They don't have an industry producing air conditioners or helicopters or private boats, a number of goods that are instead imported, 100% imported. If you have tariffs on those goods, you're not going to be distorting economic efficiency by protecting inefficient producers for the simple reason is that there are no domestic producers. Similarly, equity can be enhanced by well-designed tariffs. You don't want to tax basic necessities, but there's a good reason to put tariffs on things like automobiles, private airplanes, yachts, etc. These things are big ticket items. These aren't tiny parts of a country's import bill, particularly where you have a grotesquely unequal distribution of income that actually allows substantial numbers of people to buy not only automobiles, but also these more expensive and exclusive modes of transportation. I remember talking about this with an economist in Guatemala after that country's peace accords. And I was saying, well, Guatemala really ought to think about putting tariffs on automobiles. And he said, oh, don't forget yachts and private planes. And I said, really? Yachts and private planes in Guatemala? He said, oh, yeah. It's a big deal, right? I remember then I went from Guatemala actually to Washington, and I met the guy at the IMF who was the point man for policy in the region. And I said to him, how come the IMF's insisting on lowering tariffs in Guatemala? After all, they need the money for fulfilling their commitments under the peace accords. In fact, even Camdesu, the managing director of the IMF at that point, had stressed that was important when he visited Guatemala. And yet tariffs were the easiest way for them to do that. And here you're pushing for cutting tariffs. He says, oh, no, we can't have tariffs. They're too inefficient, right? That's the business as usual doctrinaire mindset that I'm talking about, translated into public policy, as a result of which Guatemala year after year failed to meet the fiscal targets which were actually built in to that country's peace accords. A lot of the resources that are available in the post-war period are external resources. Some of the richest people in town are the expatriates who are administering those programs. And the traditional business as usual approach in normal development assistance has been that everything the international community spends goes untaxed. The office and housing rents that these people pay, no tax on those rental payments. And these rents can be really huge. I mean, in a poor country like Afghanistan, after the Soviet-backed regime fell, international agencies were paying $10,000 a month for office space in Kabul. This isn't a country where per capita incomes were a pittance. I'm talking about taxes on the people receiving that rent, that windfall income, who were often people associated with the military and in some cases were expats. Local personnel working for these agencies, no tax on their salaries. Contractors working for these agencies, brought in from abroad to build roads or whatever, no tax on their salaries. All these people tax exempt. The reality is that if you're going to start taxing income and property, perhaps one of the most convenient places to start, as well as one of the most lucrative places to start, because that's where the money is to start with the post-war aid boom, the external assistance money coming in. And of course, their expenditures on imported goods, everything from Toyota Land Cruisers to cases of Scotch whiskey. All that comes in rent-free on the grounds that, oh no, you shouldn't tax foreign aid. And that failure to tax these resources not only undermines the ability of the government to develop the capacity to collect such taxes, but it also sends a powerful and perverse signal to the rest of the country. And that signal is rich and powerful people do not pay taxes. Well, if rich and powerful people don't pay taxes, why should ordinary people pay taxes? This was one of the recommendations that came out of that Peace in the Public Purse project. And we went around and gave presentations in, Washington, New York, Paris, London, elsewhere about this. And this was always the part that provoked the most vigorous contestation on the part of listeners who were in the so-called international community. And they'd cite multiple reasons why you can't do it, but the basic reason was, well, if you do that, that's going to reduce the amount of money the aid donors have to work with, right? It's going to tax off part of that money. And so I said, well, but the government will have the money. And they'd say, well, but the government won't do as well as we would do. They won't spend the money as wisely or effectively, efficiently as we do. Oh, so you think ordinary fill in the blank, Afghans, Salvadoreños, whoever, they should be willing to pay taxes to the government. But you're saying, actually, we don't trust them with our own money. No. That's not the message that you want to be sending. Lastly, let me turn to a third unconventional source of revenue for governments, and that is natural resource rents. There's the possibility in resource-rich countries, as so many war-torn countries are, of tapping the wealth, taking royalties from extraction of oil or minerals or timber, whatever's been extracted, and using that wealth on behalf of everybody in the country. And one way to do that, and to ensure that everybody gets a share, is to set up what are called sovereign wealth funds, the job of which is to receive those resource rents or royalties and distribute it in an equitable way to the entire population. You can insulate those natural resources from the usual rent-seeking behavior by small cliques or groups in control of the government or of the institutions that are involved in resource extraction, and you can minimize the risk that these natural resource revenues will become a source of grievance as opposed to an engine of development. And one of the things you can do where the government's capacity to spend that money is still limited is you can set up sovereign wealth funds that distribute part, if not all of the money, directly to the people as individual, equal per-person dividends to every woman, man, and child. And a good example of doing that is actually in the state of Alaska in the US, where after oil was discovered on the North Slope, the state set up something called the Alaska Permanent Fund that takes royalties from oil extraction, puts it into a fund, part of which is invested in public goods, part of which is invested in financial instruments so that even when the oil is gone, the wealth will still be there, the principle being that this wealth belongs to all Alaskans, future as well as present generations. And part of it is used to pay every year a cash dividend to every woman, man, and child in the state of Alaska. If you can prove you are a resident of Alaska, you too can receive an annual check in the mail. As you can imagine, it's a very popular program in Alaska, popular across the political spectrum, and it does a lot to ensure a basic threshold level of equity in the distribution of income in that state. Norway likewise has a well-known sovereign wealth fund that is used to be invested on behalf of the population. So setting up these kinds of funds is another way in which, in the post-conflict setting, one can potentially build revenue and ensure that it is used in a fashion that helps to glue the society back together rather than tearing it apart. Now, this is not an easy thing to do. Actually, there was an attempt to set up such a fund in Chad, in the Sahel region of Africa, in the early part of this century when the Chad-Cameroon pipeline was being built. This was a pipeline to take oil from southern Chad across Cameroon to offshore platforms where it would be loaded onto vessels to be sold abroad. Most of the money came from the oil companies that invested in it, but part of it came from the World Bank. As part of the deal, a sovereign wealth fund was set up that was meant to receive these revenues and use them in part to provide public goods in an egalitarian fashion to the people of Chad. A lot of people had hope that this would be a model, and it didn't turn out very well because in the end, the government basically captured the money, diverted money to purchases of arms and other things. The World Bank, which was meant to manage the fund, pulled out. So it didn't succeed. So I'm not saying that these things can be done with the snap of one's fingers, but it takes a long-term commitment to make them happen. Now, having talked about revenue, let me say a few words about the other side of the fiscal coin, which is expenditure. Who spends money is an important part of managing the post-conflict setting because a lot of that money is coming in from the external assistance actors. And one of the things that often de facto arises is what sometimes is called a dual public sector. One is what we usually think of as the public sector, which is the government managing its budget and its expenditure. And the other is the donors who operate a separate parallel system managing their expenditures themselves without running that money through the government. The attractions of doing so being that you can minimize what are euphemistically called leakages, or at least you can claim you're minimizing leakages by reducing corruption and so on. And the other is that you can follow your established procedures for procurement, contracts, and so on, rather than entrusting these to a state which is only starting to develop these capacities. But the dangers of having a dual public sector are that in this way you will fail to crowd in, and in fact may crowd out the capacity of the government, of the state, to itself manage expenditures. And again, you're sending that message to the public that the government can't be trusted to deliver goods and services in an efficient and equitable manner. So one way to try to address that tension between the advantages and disadvantages of a dual public sector is to have direct budget support to the government. That is to say, take external assistance resources and provide them to the government to beef up its resources for expenditure, but have some sort of dual control over those expenditures as a transitional expenditure management strategy, such that the donors, the people putting up the money, don't just give the money to the government and then have no further say in how it's used. They too have to sign off on the expenditures or substantial expenditures from those resources, providing some sort of check to make sure that they're being used fairly, wisely, and efficiently. It's a little cumbersome to have dual control, but compared to the alternative of a dual public sector, it has things to recommend it. Another piece of that expenditure puzzle in a post-conflict setting, apart from who spends the money, is who sells things to the government. Governments buy things, and they buy a lot of things, and as do the external assistance actors in the wake of a conflict, because there's a lot to rebuild. And here there's a tension often between expediency, which leads to procurement of resources from abroad, and economic recovery, which would lead to trying to procure as much as you can locally as a way to rebuild and stimulate the local economy. Let me give you an example. This one comes from Timor-Leste, or formerly known as East Timor, a country that became independent from Indonesia after a protracted civil war. It emerged as one of the poorest countries in the world at the time. In the early years, East Timor was actually run by a United Nations transitional administration. The United Nations actually was the government for a while in East Timor before it was handed over to the Timorese themselves. And among the things that were procured in that early stage were desks for schools. And the question is, where are you going to get school desks? So one option, an option that kind of makes sense to me, would be you hire local carpenters and builders. They're forest resources. You can use those resources to harvest lumber, mill the lumber, and build desks. And that may take a little while because the infrastructure to do all that doesn't already exist. There aren't firms that already have a vendor code in your procurement system for providing those desks. But you can do that. And if you did that, you would have helped to rebuild or build the local economy. Instead, they imported the school desks from Australia, as I recall. This again is in our book, Peace in the Public Purse. And the rationale was that, we'll be able to get the school desks, really quickly, and these people are already approved as vendors, et cetera, et cetera. Well, to my mind, that's a short-sighted, myopic approach, right? For certain kinds of things where you're meeting immediate pressing humanitarian needs, okay, there may be a case for importing the stuff rather than for procuring it locally. But when you're talking about something like this, something that's a bit longer term, like school desks, there's a very strong case for favoring local procurement. Other examples would include food for expatriate personnel, typically all flown in rather than procured locally. Fuel In Somalia, in the wake of the conflict there, when the international community had a large footprint on the ground, including a lot of personnel and vehicles, they had a tanker offshore that piped the fuel in, and they would come and refill the vehicles right there, rather than using that fuel as the basis for starting to rebuild the destroyed network of fuel delivery stations around even Mogadishu, the capital, let alone wider in the country. Given that these are the resources that are available to work with, this is the money that's available, there are ways to use that money to rebuild the local economy rather than just substitute for it and assume that somehow it's all going to magically sprout like a mushroom once the money dries up and you leave.